It's time, Michael. Sorry, didn't have a lighter. Production budget at Woodsman Studios, not that great, but stick around for my review after the intro. Welcome to my review for Halloween 2. Yeah, I'd like to get all of these Halloweens done eventually, but maybe not straight after the other Bang Bang Bang, because there are quite a lot of them. I was just thinking earlier, actually, wouldn't it be funny if they'd taken the horror comedy route with this film, like Texas Chainsaw 2? You would have had maybe Michael on the front of the box, like, oh, it just gives me a shudder. But no, this is a serious sequel, a direct continuation of the first film. And if you don't know where we left it, then you need to just go and watch the first film and then come back for a start. Can't imagine that's the case with whoever might be watching this. So in terms of plot, there's not much for me to add if maybe you've seen the first but not the second, except to add that the whole of the second film pretty much takes place in a hospital setting. So is it as good as the first one? No, it's not. The first one obviously is a masterpiece. It was always going to be hard for the second one to follow that up. It's still a decent effort, but it does have plenty of negatives, and I'm going to get into those, starting with the most obvious one, the twist that Laurie is actually Michael's sister. This was just completely unnecessary, and it doesn't even make any sense, because if you think back to the first film, when Michael first sets eyes on Laurie from the porch of his house, I mean, Haddonfield could be a town with 15, 20,000 people in it. What are the odds that the first person he sees looking out from his porch would be his sister? And I just don't see why Michael would need an excuse to follow Laurie to the hospital. He's already chased her through town in part one. It's obviously a game that has to be seen out to its conclusion once he starts stalking her. So he could just carry on stalking her without it needing to be a brother-sister thing. So I'm definitely not in agreement with that. It's not a plot point that bothers me by the time we get to the fourth or the fifth film. I've got over it by that point, and I'm just, but the second film bears the responsibility of it. So in this movie, at least, I can talk about this and criticize it. So what difference does it make in the end? Not much, actually, because there's not much payoff for this development. We get fed the information, and then there's nothing in the last 10, 15 minutes. It's almost as if they added this in post-production, and the rest of the movie was just already as it was. It's not as if we have a scene at the end where Laurie's pleading with Michael to stop because they're related and they can work things out when he's in prison and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that would be pretty terrible if they'd done that. But because the twist doesn't have any real bearing on the rest of the film, I almost can't count it as a negative, because it doesn't affect my viewing of the film. It'd be pretty easy, actually, to make a fan edit of this film where you take out that conversation of Loomis and Marion, and it would hardly change the movie. Anyway, moving on to Laurie, my next big negative, and this one actually does affect the movie considerably more so. Now, I talked about in the first film about how Laurie Strode is one of the greatest final girls of all time, but in this film, she just becomes complete 180. She's almost a non-entity of a character. It's quite crazy, the turnaround. I mean, she spends the first half of the film drugged, and in the second half she gets up to take part in some chases, but there's literally no character development. There's no character. It's just almost a blank slate, and it's not Jamie Lee Curtis's fault. It's just the way it was written. But this does feel like a film that almost has no protagonist. It's really strange. I kind of feel like Jamie Lee as Laurie should have been a secondary character in this film, and somebody else should have taken over final girl responsibilities. Possibly Janet. I think out of the characters that we get elsewhere in the hospital, she's the most likely from what I've seen, but I don't know. That takes me on nicely to the other characters, because they're not great. They're not well explored. There's more of them in this film, but we just don't get to know them enough so that when their deaths come around, it's meaningful in any way. In the first movie, we got to know these secondary characters like Annie and Linda quite well, so that when they died, it actually meant something. But we just don't spend enough time with this new set of individuals. I think the film comes in at about 90 minutes, 95 minutes. Just an extra 10 minutes would have done. Take it over the 100-minute mark. That wouldn't have made it an excessively long film. You know, just a few extra scenes early on for those characters for us to get to know them. But as it is, it's just not enough time. Special effects could have been better in the movie. There's at least 2 kills where I just look at them and think, you could have done better there, guys. You know, there's a hammer to the head which sounds like it's hitting a rubber prop, and there's this kill with a needle going in this woman's eye, and it just, the effect of the needle going in doesn't have any effect on the eye looking at the front. It's really bizarre. But so maybe a little bit more, just a bit more touching up in post-production could have helped there, or just reworking the practical effects a little bit. I talked about Laurie being not as good as she was in the first film. The same is true of Michael Myers. In the first film, my review for the first film, I talked about how it's not just his kills that make him scary, but his really odd and erratic behaviour. Well, in this film, all that's gone. He's literally just the killing machine side, which would be fine if this was the 7th, 8th film, and I've got used to him being like that by that point. But in the second film, it's slightly jarring that we get that scary side of him just completely eradicated, and we're just purely into the kills side. You could argue that this is part 2 of a story, and if you take it as a whole, then maybe we've just moved past that behaviour earlier on in the day, and because we're in nighttime and we've already had the Laurie Michael stalking scene where he's killed a few people just before that as well. Maybe he is into kill mode, now it's nighttime. You could argue it that way, I suppose, but it's something I noticed, and the mask is different. It's not meant to be different, but it's noticeably different in this film, so that's another thing. So I'll move on to the positives. Now, it sounds like I've put a lot of negatives out there. I will say they're not things that actually affect my enjoyment of the movie that much, but I just wanted to be fair and put them out there. But they're not huge black marks against the film. There's no one thing that really takes this film down. And like I said, the thing with Laurie and Michael being related barely even has any effect on the final product. So, but let's get into the things that are good. And I'll start off with just mentioning the music, actually, because I noticed in my first review, well, my review of the first film, I didn't mention the music. I was so caught up in everything else. Obviously, the soundtrack for Halloween 1 is absolutely amazing. And in the second film, it just kind of adds to that. It just reworks it a little bit. You could even say that it's better in this film, although the first film did it first and gets the marks for the originality, you know. Second film, though, has got Mr. Sandman. I think that is a really good addition. It just feels right. And I really liked it when they brought it back later on for H2O as well. Kills in this film are better than in number 1 overall, despite some dodgy effects, I would say. There's some good off-screen kills as well. I mean, I'm not saying that you can just pack a film full of kills and make it better than Halloween 1. You know, you put 50 kills in a movie, it's just going to be a complete turd of a movie, you know. But in this film, it's okay. It feels like there's a lot of them for a Halloween film, which is based more around suspense and tension than, you know, your more bloodbath type of slasher films. But it just about gets away with it, although I'm not sure I'd want a Halloween film with too many more kills than we get in number 2. It feels like there is a lot of them. But by far my biggest thing that I like about this film is just the general setting. It's a really creepy atmosphere, setting it in a hospital. I used to play a lot of survival horror games on PlayStation, and like Silent Hill, Resident Evil, and they would constantly bring back the hospital setting because it's just a creepy setting to have horror in, you know. And it's easy to forget, if you haven't been in a hospital for a while for real, just how big they are when you're in them, and how much they feel like a rabbit warren. There's corridors going this way and that, dead ends, and it's a good place to have a showdown with a serial killer. It's really creepy atmosphere, this film, and there's not that many, because it's the middle of the night, there's not that many people around. I've heard it said that it's a silly, it's unrealistic because there's just not that many patients, but they could be behind closed doors and we just don't know. I do think the filmmakers missed a trick. In Halloween, in the latest one that came out in 2018, there's a terrific sequence where Michael, we see a long shot of him going into these houses and just randomly killing people one after the other. How great would it have been if he'd have done that in the hospital, maybe out of frustration about of not being able to find Laurie's room, but that could have been a great take. I don't know why it took 11 films for somebody to think of this magical shot that we get in Halloween 2018, but there you are. There's some good continuity in this film that I'd like to mention. John Carpenter, I believe, was the first person who had a go at the drafts for this, and you can tell that there's been a good attempt at you know, keeping the continuity going, keeping the world building consistent. There's a mention of Russellville. Ben Tramer, just a character who's just mentioned in passing in the first film, is a fully fledged person walking around in this movie, at least for a little while. So I did appreciate that. It kind of goes to hell with the whole brother-sister thing, but at least it doesn't affect the movie, as I've already said. And there's some good randomness in Halloween 2. I did complain a little bit earlier in the review about Michael just being a killing machine, but that is balanced out a bit by some chaotic stuff that could only happen on a night where a town has gone to hell and everybody's confused and panicking and running around like headless chickens. You know, you've got the boy who comes into the hospital with the bizarre razor blade in his mouth. How did that happen? I mentioned Ben Tramer. He gets into an accident with a police car. You've got Jimmy slipping in the blood. So there are these random things that are just happening left, right, and centre. So thankfully, it's not just Michael's kills. It is a kind of torrent of all kinds of things going off, which just kind of adds to the overall spice of it, if you like. So on the whole, I really like this film. It's grown on me over time. I didn't have the best relationship with it for quite some time because I used to have this really dodgy cut of it on DVD, and it was scratchy and the picture wasn't great, audio wasn't great. And a few years ago, I upgraded it to a really good Blu-ray, and since then, I've just gradually really developed an appreciation for it. It used to be, I thought, one of the weaker sequels, but now I think it's probably one of the best. So yeah, I really like Halloween 2. Obviously, it's not quite as good as number 1, but overall, I would say that it's very, very strong, and it's to its benefit that it's a complete follow-on from number 1. You really could get a release, potentially, of number 1 and number 2 in the same package as just one continual story. I think that would be awesome, but I can't see it ever happening. So let's get the bag of terror out and find out what score I've given Halloween 2. Quite a heavy bag. Lots of axes fell out. We've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that is an excellent score for Halloween 2. Doesn't quite come close to the 5 bloody axes that Halloween 1 got, but did you expect it to, really? So yeah, I'm a massive fan of this series, and I'm a big fan of Halloween 2. There's no pin for the horror locations map tonight because we've already done Haddonfield. I'm not going to put 2 pins in for the same fictional town, so sadly not. I will be back soon-ish for Halloween 3, my review of that, so keep an eye out. But until then, cheerio, bye-bye.